Hello and welcome to the TTI Distribution Download, the podcast where we talk about all things happening in the world of electronic components with the specialists of TTI. And now, your host for the TTI Distribution Download, Paula Renfrow.
Thanks, Jim. Hey, everybody, and thanks for plugging into the TTI Distribution Download. This episode, we welcome back Dennis Reed of Edgewater Research for Q3 market results. Hey, Dennis, before we jump into your report out, I know you've been around town. What have you discovered this quarter?
Thanks, and good to be here, and thank you, Paula, for the introduction. Travel-wise, the last 90 days has been, I would say, relatively quiet on my end. A couple of trips to our office in Cleveland, which is always great. We do an annual offsites and things like that, which is always great to plan for the end of this year and into next year. Industry-wide, unfortunately, did not attend ECIA, which I think was last week.
It was. We missed you.
I know. It was one of those ones where with Electronica coming up in, I think, 2 weeks.
Oh, right. 2 weeks from now. Yeah.
From now, when I kind of went through how much time do I want to spend on the road and all that good stuff, have a pretty full and exciting and very much schedule for Electronica. So kind of opted to stay home this year. I know ECIA is always a great event and seeing all the people is wonderful. But yeah, so I didn't do that. So a lot of, I would say, kind of internal corporate travel for the third quarter on my end. But the big one, the every other year, Electronica's right here on the horizon. So that should be
Right. It's upcoming.
that should be great. So yeah, that's been kind of the travel side. And I would say outside of that big picture on the industry, it's hard to believe we're less than 90 days left in the year. It's hard to believe.
Isn't that crazy?
I know. It's hard to believe here in October. We're officially 2 years off the peak sales numbers, so it's been a pretty prolonged downturn. So, I've been doing a lot more Zoom teams, et cetera, trying to figure out when this thing's going to hopefully turn for the right side.
Oh, goodness. Yeah. So when we get through here, you're going to give us that answer.
I hope so.
Okay. Well, and also we will look forward to, it's not like Electronica slipped my mind, but, there for a moment. So when we get back together after the first of the year, you'll give us a little read on that as well.
Oh, 100%. I love any of the industry events, but I in particular love Electronica just because it is staggered every other year. So people that you don't see maybe at like an EDS that's every year, more so from EMEA and other parts of the region. It's just great because there's kind of a little bit longer tail in between those conversations. So
yeah, so you can get built up for it. But you know what? As a matter of fact, probably a lot of our listeners don't know much about Electronica. So would you mind? Could you give us just a little overview? What kind of people are there? What kind of conversations do you have?
Great, and I probably won't do the event itself any justice. So I would obviously for the listeners recommend for all the stats that I'll probably butcher. But Electronica takes place in Munich, Germany every other year. And I would say it's the largest trade show of the areas that we focus in our research. And that's a pretty broad line. But when you think of kind of the big three for the industry, you have CES in Las Vegas every year in January. That really covers the consumer electronics, dabbles a bit into automotive. Great event. You have Computex in June in Taiwan every year, and that's very big in the compute memory, that whole supply chain. And then you have Electronica, which really hits a whole host of kind of your traditional, maybe more mass market. So it's big in distribution. It's big from an IP&E standpoint. It's big from a semiconductor standpoint. It is around IoT. It is around electrification. It's around kind of all those mega trends that are not centered around, let's say, compute and AI right now, although I'm sure AI will be very, very present this year as that expands. So it's a great event. The audience for us when we go there, what I enjoy about it is it's really kind of the mix of participants, if you will. So when you look at various suppliers, distributors, et cetera, who I'm there meeting with, their personnel that arrive really extend from kind of the executive suite, CEOs, CFOs, et cetera, to sales management, whether it's Americas, throughout EMEA, in some cases Asia Pacific as well. And then you also do have kind of the technical aspect in there as well. So the size of it, I think 2 years ago, they had something like 75,000 visitors over a 3-day window or something like that. So you really do kind of cross everything from kind of the executive suite down to the design engineer, which is why I find so much value in it.
So if we say CES, because I'm going to say here, at least in our region, that's probably more, or definitely more recognizable. So if CES is the target audience, I'm going to call it, just it's built for, say, the retailer, right? Consumer electronics.
100%.
Would you say electronica? Yeah, is electronica, would you call that the same focus for manufacturing engineer, design engineer?
Yes, I would. I would. So I would sub in kind of that retailer for end user and or when you look at distributors, suppliers, executive teams doing their big picture strategic meetings as well. So it is
Technology conversations? Yeah.
a lot of technology conversations, a lot of business conversations. And again, I think I've been to other events like this past, I think we talked a little bit about it. In March, I went to the Embedded World. I know the Embedded World group actually just had their first one in Austin in October. Embedded World was tremendous, but the entire audience was design engineer and end user, which is
Right.
wonderful for the participants, but for where Edgewater tends to interact the most, it's more on kind of that business side, if you will. So having the sales leadership and the executive leadership on top of that is why I think we find so much value for our company at it.
Right. So, yeah, to gather that data to give this market condition report that we're about to get into, shall we?
100%.
So let's dive into Q3 market conditions report just you recently published on Market Eye. Specifically, the continued focus on customer inventory reduction, like the phrase of the year, right?
Yeah, the phrase of the year and almost the phrase of the last 2 years, as I mentioned.
Yeah, you just said that. It's been 2 years. Yeah.
It's been 2 years, and I think there's kind of a couple of things in there. So when you look at the state of inventory, and then maybe if you take it down to the state of the inventory drawdown and kind of where we are right now, I mean, I think it is important, first of all, to say not all product categories, not all end markets are created equal when we look at the status of the inventory. So with that, I think there's still a strong delineation between the semiconductor space and the IP&E space, with semis having still a lot more work to do, which if you trace back that to the peak shortage on the semi side, clearly we would point to the prolific use of non-cancelable, non-returnable, which pulled forward a lot more demand and or pushed it onto distribution, onto customers, et cetera. So there's a lot of work still left to do in the semi side. On the IP&E side, we feel much better. I would say that the inventory is more rapidly approaching kind of normalized levels. But again, I think when you look at some of the data exiting the second quarter, which again is a touch dated now, you're still looking at dollars in days of inventories that are still strong double digits above kind of the similar levels prior to COVID. So when we think about it, more importantly going forward, there's the concept of obviously we were just in time prior to COVID. Everybody went to just in case, and I think at one of the TTI breakfasts, I think Mr. Drabeck even said we went from just in time to just in case to just too darn much, which is a line that I love to steal and cite credit where it's due. But so we're still in this just too darn much. I think objectively, when we look at it, there are certain industries that are going to go right back to just in time. And there are concrete examples during the shortage. If you take Tim Cook, the CEO of Apple, on one of their financial calls, I can't remember which one, but you're talking about Apple, who's arguably one of the best component procurers in the world, if not the best. They carry 8 days of inventory on their own books at the peak. And Tim Cook was saying then, we want to drive our inventory back to where it was prior to COVID because it's too expensive for us to carry inventory. they're very good. They've got a very complex supply chain. They can navigate it with the ODM. But yeah, I think when you extrapolate, that's on one end of the extreme that they're probably going to drive back down to 5 days or whatever. When you look at whether it's distribution or some of the markets like that with the publicly traded distributors at least, they're one of them was their 20 plus year average was around 60 days, and they're still up, I think, around 100. And then the other is close to 75 days is the 20-year average, and they're up near 120. Uh, it's expensive to hold inventory. So the focus is still, I think, clearing it out in particular semis. But again, would say we're further along. Uh, than we were obviously 90 days. So would expect more drawdown. And I think more importantly, as we roll into the end of the year here, there could be a push from the supplier base on distribution and EMS to take product. But I think the flip is, from our view, most of distribution EMS is still firmly in the camp of trying to draw it down, especially in the face of a somewhat uncertain kind of demand environment right now.
Yeah. So one area that's been that has done well for all of us, I believe in this, I believe all of us when I say that, is aerospace and defense. What do you see in there?
Yeah, so aerospace and defense, first and foremost, I would say it's still the brightest bulb on the tree. So the market is still in a growth environment, but I will say it's kind of important to note that we've at least seen the growth rates moderate in the third quarter of the year. So to try to put some general, because it is the business inherently is lumpy, right? It's program driven. It's things like that. So it is lumpy by nature. But if that business was growing in the strong double digit range, really over the last year and a half, maybe 2 years, we've seen it kind of moderate into that single digit range.
Mm-hmm.
When we kind of pull behind the why of that,
Mm-hmm.
there's a couple of things. I think the knee-jerk reaction most people like to blame is the election,
Mm-hmm.
that's a week out. I don't really subscribe to that. I think if you really dig behind it, any defense contractor, any of these programs, they have contingencies, whether it's a Democrat or a Republican controlled White House. So I don't think that's not as much of an issue there. I think it's part of what I would say with the election in general. It's more of a distraction for every industry where we sit right now. But so there is some talk around that. But I think there are the fact that it's grown strong double digits for a couple of years, so the law of large numbers impacts it. That's one. Two, I do think whether, regardless of the side of the aisle you sit on politically, the government they've been running on 90-day continuing resolutions and things like that. So you've got that kind of uncertainty that I think reigns more supreme than what party wins the White House. So I think that's a real factor. And then along with it, and I think one that not a lot of people just tend to forget, the fiscal year kind of ends for the federal government at the end of September, right? So we kind of ran into the end of the summer. You've got kind of this, what are we going to do with the budget from Congress and how does that flow through to the Pentagon and everything else? So there's just some uncertainty in an otherwise lumpy business. So I think we're moving through it. I still go back to when you look at the long-term secular decline, we're in a relatively, I think, unstable environment with the unfortunate conflicts in Europe, as well as the Middle East. And then you've got this continued digitalization, if you will, of our armed service, where it's converting over to two-way radios, it's hypersonic missiles, it's really kind of prepping for quote unquote the war of the future, is believed, if you read any of the Pentagon budgets or you read any of the transcripts from any of the defense contractors, that's going to be fought via cyber warfare. That's going to be fought with hypersonic missiles. It's going to involve satellite systems, right? So it is different than kind of your historical trench warfare. So it's a different spend that is good ultimately for our industry long term, even though I think you can argue that that's ultimately a doomsday scenario. It's not great for the world.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, that's kind of the environment that we're in when the aerospace and defense marketplace.
Here at TTI, we consider we have the same group of people that are specialists. When I say aerospace and defense, I'm referring also to just a very special market called space.
Yes.
Anything going on there?
Yeah, so we touched a little bit on it with the satellite, and I think that's kind of the biggest, most tangible one. And some of the facts that I'll reference are a touch dated, but I think they still show the trend. I mean, as you've seen if you've seen the overall space race, let's just say, move away from the government into the private sector, whether that's the SpaceX, the Blue Origins, there's been naturally kind of a cost curve that's been taken. I think if not to obviously endorse Elon Musk or anything, but read his autobiography when he talks about SpaceX. And one of the fundamental things to him was reusable rockets, right? In lowering that cost of a launch. So if you think of that, um, you're talking tens of thousands of dollars of interconnect products or electronic components, even maybe more broadly on every satellite that's being launched. And some estimates that we've seen, you're talking upwards of thousands of those per month. And I don't know what they were 20 years ago, but I would venture to say if you look at a SpaceX or somebody like that can launch a satellite in, bring the booster back, catch it with a pair
Calipers
of
or chops,
oversized
right?
chopsticks. Yeah, oversized chopsticks, all kidding aside, and then reload for the next launch. That's a pretty powerful value proposition there. One, two, you've seen companies like Starlink, when you talk about delivering the internet to more rural areas or to areas, impacted by disaster or the world, right? You need satellites to do it. The thing that I'm not a specialist, but I do read about, you look at the amount of satellites and or space junk floating orbit, and what do we do with that problem? Because it everything I read looks like it's a growing issue that we need to resolve, but we continue to put uh, satellites into space. And yeah, I think it's a highly specialized, highly technical, extremely harsh environment that when you look at the product side, and there's indeed a level of sophistication or expertise, talking as you referenced, Paula, about your teams, needed to support those. So I think that is another strong grower. And there's nothing from, call it a civilian and or military use case that says it's going to slow anytime soon.
Yeah. So, I can't sign us off without asking a forecasting question. So, what's your future thinking, Dennis?
Yeah, I think when there's less than 90 days for 24. So we'll give the real tough start. Don't expect much of a change. I think the good news is we found a bottom. The bad news is we're not going anywhere from this bottom, at least in 24. And I think that's going to be the challenge as we get into 25. Most of our work points to a second half 2025 recovery. And I think for the the interconnect side, that's probably a 6%. So back to historical for the year with strong double-digit growth. Second half of the year, maybe a little slower in the first half. Passive probably rebounding closer to the 5 range again, similar trend. But what I would say with it is, as we talked earlier, it's been 2 years, right? So when this downturn started, it was, well, it's 6 months and it's going to recover in the second half of 23. Then that became early 24 and late 24. And I think now people are just throwing in the towel. They're throwing in the towel a little bit for the first half of the year. And I think what's going to be important in call it the real touch point for the direction of next year is where inventory sits coming out of the Lunar New Year in China. China's put a little bit of stimulus in the system, which is good news. Um, and something that they really haven't done yet. The inventory over there is a lot better. I mean, there's sub pockets there of AI and things like that have AI's grown, compute and smartphones have returned to kind of more growth at a lower level. But if we can get through that holiday kind of shutdown in that part of the world where I don't think there's going to be much of a pull ahead, if you will, early in the year to get ahead of it. If we can come out of there clean, that does kind of potentially have the opportunity to pull that recovery in maybe into the second quarter versus the first quarter. So maybe we're a little bit conservative right now. But I think, again, after 2 years of being through it, probably the conservatism's warranted just with how stubbornly high the inventory's been.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Second quarter 2025.
Yeah. Best case.
Or conservative case.
Yes.
Yes, conservative case. Well, thank you for breaking it down for us again today, Dennis. We'll chat again in the new year and talk a little more about Electronica.
Absolutely, Paula. Looking forward to it and looking forward to seeing everybody in Electronica.
Yeah, yeah. So since we won't be chatting again till the new year, let me wish you early happy holidays to you and your family.
Thank you, and you as well.
Mm-hmm. And thanks to our listeners for plugging in. If you learned something today, tune in next quarter, as we just said, when Dennis will break down Q4 and we'll kick off the new year. Until then, you can follow Dennis weekly, his weekly digest, and other subject matter experts at tti.com/MarketEye.
That's it for this episode of the TTI Distribution Download. For more information on any of the topics you heard about today, reach out to your nearby TTI branch at 1-800-CALL-TTI or visit us online at tti.com.